Welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger K. Green, and this is going to be contextualized reading for Book 5 of Homer's Odyssey. And as I've been alluding in earlier contextualized readings, this is the first book where we actually get to interact as readers with Odysseus directly. But we open up again with a bit of a summary, which is helpful for us in our contextualized readings because Athena is appealing to Zeus once more, as she's been doing throughout the first 5 books. But we're getting a bit of a recap. And I think that this definitely, if we think about this as being told as an oral tale, these are memory devices. These are landing points for whoever is doing the storytelling to sort of recap and remember themselves without having to refer to text, these points and moments in the story. And you see that throughout the storytelling itself. Excuse me. So you will see, I'll note some parallel patterns between Odysseus's relationships between goddesses in this chapter. And then this kind of almost like, I almost think of like an accordion type of storytelling that there's the long note that you have to pull out to get the air, and then you're kind of squeezing back in and squeezing back in and squeezing back in until you kind of run out of air, and then you have to hit a long note. I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever played an accordion, but just think of it in terms of the lungs or the breath, right? So like we have to breathe in, and we only have so much air that we can breathe out when we're singing a note or talking. And that all of that sort of relates us back to thinking a little bit about oratory, which is not, I mean, I think it's something that gets talked a lot about when people teach the Odyssey, in terms of what can we see in this literary text that harkens back to its oral renditions, right? And this, of course, like oral storytelling is something that continues to persist in today's culture, right, as well. So if we were doing a class on the Sundiata epic of Africa, right? Those stories are still told in multi-day festivals throughout Africa. I've been reading a little bit about Homer and just around stuff as I'm making this course, and one of the mythology books that I was reading was kind of referring to Homer as maybe one of our earliest literary authors, in the sense that what we get from Homer, whether or not that's a kind of fictional composite of people, what we get from Homer is it seems like a unified style enough to call it a single author. And we give a name to the author instead of just being an anonymous storyteller. And we will see throughout the text, as we already have a little bit, that there is this attention to bards and the storytellers in the text, and don't blame the bards and things like that. So we see the preferences for the narrator throughout. But I'll try and just sort of remind us along the way when I see things that maybe make us think about what aspects of the text refer us back to the oral tradition. And the oral tradition just definitely has to do with memory, right? So how the question is how much one can store in one's own mind. And we know from various different studies that even in the 19th century, humans carried a lot more memory in their heads than they do today, because we don't need to. We can be reminded by Google and by our phones sort of constantly. This was of course, an issue that goes all the way back to Plato's dialogues, like the Phaedrus and the Gorgias, which are very, very important early dialogues for rhetoricians like myself. But in those dialogues, Socrates is warning about writing, right? That this new invention of writing is going to take away people's memories. And so we still have today, in the 21st century, we definitely still have people worrying about our relationship to technology and the perhaps negative effects that might be occurring. So this opening passage, I feel like, is doing a lot of memory work, and it's doing a lot of recapping work. So let's jump in here. As dawn rose up from bed by her lordly mate Tithonus, and so this is like just notice that dawn is referred to differently than the normal rosy red fingers line, and so that change might actually sort of indicate that there's something going on in the oral tradition that says when you get to this point, we can refer to dawn differently, and that's a little place marker, right? As dawn rose up from bed by her lordly mate Tithonus, bringing light to immortal gods and mortal men, the gods sat down in council, circling Zeus, the Thunder King, whose power rules the world. Athena began, recalling Odysseus to their thoughts. The goddess, deeply moved by the man's long ordeal, held captive still in the nymph Calypso's cave. That's all stuff that we've learned, in the first 4 books. Father Zeus, you other happy gods who never die, never let any sceptered king be kind and gentle now, not with all his heart, or set his mind on justice. No, let him be cruel and always practice outrage. Think, not one of the people whom he ruled remembers Odysseus now, that godlike man, and kindly as a father to his children. Now he's left to pine on an island racked with grief in the nymph Calypso's house. She holds him there by force. He has no way to voyage home to his own native land, no trim ships in reach, no crew to ply the oars, and sending him scudding over the sea's broad back. And now his dear son, they plot to kill the boy on his way back home. Yes, he has sailed off for the news of his father, to holy Pylos first, then out to the sunny hills of Lacedaemon. Okay, so yeah, the great recapping of what's going on, and we get this response, and there is often this light rebuke response that comes from Zeus, and we've seen this as a pattern, even if you think back to book 4, when Menelaus is rebuking one of his men about whether or not they should treat Telemachus and Philostratus as guests, right? And Menelaus says, you normally you're pretty smart. Normally you do pretty well, but what the hell is happening to you right now? Kind of like rebukes him. Zeus's rebuke to Athena is always gentle. She appears to be his favorite, or one of his favorites anyway. He says, "My child," Zeus, who marshals the thunderheads, replied, "What nonsense you let slip through your teeth. Come now, wasn't the plan your own? You conceived it yourself. Odysseus shall return and pay the traitors back. Telemachus, sail him home with your skill. The power is yours, no doubt. Home to his native country, all unharmed, while the suitors limp to port, defeated, baffled men." You can take care of it. You can do this. You've got this, Athena. And then he turns to Hermes, right? And what I want you to sort of notice again in these opening passages is we know what is going to happen at the end of the story, right? We know that it's been fated that Odysseus is going to make it home. We know he's got the goddesses and the gods on his side, all except for Poseidon. And so we know what's going to happen. But what we're interested in is the unfolding of the events and the process of the storytelling itself when we're looking at Homer. So with these words, Zeus turned to his own son Hermes. Hermes is, of course, the messenger god. Mercury in the Roman translation of the Greek pantheon. So he turns to Hermes. "You are our messenger, Hermes, sent on all our missions. Announce to the nymph with lovely braids our fixed decree. Odysseus journeys home. The exile must return. But not in the convoy of the gods or mortal men. No, on a leashed makeshift raft and wrung with pains. On the 20th day he will make his landfall, fertile Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians, close kin to the gods themselves, who with all their hearts will prize him like a god, and send him off in a ship to his own beloved land, giving him bronze and hoards of gold and robes, more plunder than he could ever have won from Troy, if Odysseus had returned intact with his fair share. So everything's going to be restored for this guy. So his destiny ordains, he shall see his loved ones reach his high-roofed house, his native land, at last. Okay, so we're supposed to be reassured, apparently, by this. If we were worried about Odysseus, he's going to have some trials. They're necessary for him, but he's going to be okay in the end. So Zeus decreed, and the giant-killing guide, Hermes again, obeyed at once. And then we get this kind of nice transportation down to Calypso's island. Quickly under his feet he fastened the supple sandals, ever glowing gold, that wing him over the waves and boundless earth with rush of gusty winds. He seized the wand that enchants the eyes of men whenever Hermes wants or wakes us from sleep. That wand, in his grip, the powerful giant killer swooping down from Pieria down to the high clear air, plunged into the sea and skimmed the waves like a tern that down the deadly gulfs of the barren salt swells glides and dives for fish, dipping its beating wings and bursts of spray. So Hermes skimmed the crests on endless waves. But once he gained that island worlds apart, up from the deep blue sea, he climbed to the dry land and strode on till he reached the spacious cave, where the nymph with a lovely braids had made her home, and he found her there inside. So just one thing I want to point out in this passage, although it does seem that the language seems to sort of flow and match even in the English translation, this kind of lifting up the image of the god Hermes, who puts on his winged sandals and then has this scepter and is sort of flying through the air, right? And we get one of these turns of phrase or these stylistic choices that Homer the poet makes, which is the simile. And of course, when I was taking English classes in high school, this was always something that my dear English professor always wanted to sort of emphasize. So I feel it's like my duty. So if we go back to that passage, like a tern that down the deadly gulfs of barren salt swells glides and dives for fish, dipping its beating wings in bursts of spray, so Hermes skimmed the crests on endless crests. Okay, so he's like a bird. He's like a bird seeking prey that's just like moving through the ocean seamlessly. A really nice image. And then we get a shift here when we see Calypso. And I want us to sort of notice the kind of almost nostalgic. So the term nostalgia means homesickness. But the warmth of description that is given to Calypso's cave here. A great fire blazed on the hearth, and the smell of cedar cleanly split, and sweet wood burning bright wafted a cloud of fragrance down the island. Deep inside she sang, the goddess Calypso, lifting her breathtaking voice as she glided back and forth before her room, her golden shuttle weaving. Thick, luxuriant woods grew round the cave, alders and black poplars, pungent cypress too, and there birds roosted, folding their long wings, owls and hawks, and the spread-beaked ravens of the sea, black skimmers who make their living off the waves, and round the mouth of the cavern trailed the vine, laden with clusters, bursting with ripe grapes. 4 springs in a row, bubbling, clear and cold, running side by side, took channels left and right. Soft meadows spreading round where starred with violets, lush with beds of parsley. Why, even a deathless god who came upon that place would gaze and wonder, heart entranced with pleasure. a pretty nice place, right? We're setting up for this is where Odysseus has been hanging out. Um, and then we see that the poet is setting up Hermes too, right? So Hermes, the guide, the mighty giant killer, stood there spellbound, like, holy crap, this place is amazing, right? And so, just again, those moments of almost like freeze frame. So we want to note the kind of cinematography of the poet's storytelling, how we move from one image, we move from, Athena and Zeus, um, uh, and then this dialogue, and then we see this god put on the winged sandals and flows down, and then we see this amazing hearth, and this island. And it's so much that we almost get like a freeze frame, like that you see sometimes in Japanese animation does this a lot, where to emphasize drama, it will just, like a character will just freeze. I always think of that when I'm reading over these passages. So once he'd filled his fill of marveling at all, he briskly entered the deep vaulted cavern. Calypso, lustrous goddess, knew him at once, as soon as she saw his features face to face. Immortals are never strangers to each other, no matter how distant one may make her home. So it's an interesting sort of turn in the text front that the author, the narrator here, the narrative voice, turns and tells us, the reader, they give us some information, Homer does, about what gods can do. And I think that when we think about the moments of disrecognition or misrecognition that are constantly happening in the text, and how that relates back to the thing like the custom or law of xenia, of hospitality, all of that, don't tell me who you are until after you've eaten, that kind of move, which we'll see in this chapter as well. It's important that I think that the poet is making that kind of distinctive claim here about that gods know who each other are. But as for great Odysseus, Hermes could not find him within the cave. Off he sat in the headland, weeping there as always, wrenching his heart with sobs and groans and anguish, gazing out over the barren sea through blinding tears. So this is one of our first glimpses of Odysseus, and he's crying off at the edge of this beautiful island. And so I think that the island has been set up to be that beautiful, to emphasize, just how sad Odysseus is. And then Calypso, lustrous goddess, questioned Hermes, seating him on the glistening polished chair. God of the golden wand, why have you come? A beloved, honored friend, but it's been so long. Your visits are much too rare. Tell me what's on your mind. I'm eager to do it. Whatever I can do, whatever can be done. So, want to see that Calypso treats Hermes very warmly. And then there we see xenia happening even with the gods here, right? So, and the goddess drew a table up beside him, heaped with ambrosia, mixed him deep red nectar. Hermes, the guide and giant killer, ate and drank. Once he had dined and fortified himself with food, he launched right in, replying to her questions. As one god to another, you ask me why I've come. I'll tell you the whole story, mince no words. Your wish is my command. It was Zeus who made me come, no choice of mine. Who would willingly roam across a salty waste so vast, so endless? Think, no city of men in sight, and not a soul to offer the gods a sacrifice and burn the fattest victims. I think that there's something important about the where Calypso's island seems to be. It seems to be so far away that although she's immortal, she is not worshipped. It says something about her relationship as a nymph, that she's not a god like the gods who go up to and hang out in assembly at Mount Olympus, right? So here she is not getting sacrifices, right? She's distant. He says, there's no way, for another god to thwart the will of storming Zeus and make it come to nothing. Zeus claims you keep beside you a most unlucky man, most harried of all who fought for the Priam's Troy 9 years back, sacking the city of the 10th in the 10th year, and then set sail for home. But voyaging back, they outraged Queen Athena, whose loosed gales and pounding seas against them. So this is all just kind of recap that we're getting from the Trojan War and from what brings Odysseus into this situation. And now Zeus commands you to send him off with all good speed. And Calypso has this reaction. And there are lots of, of course, there's the Penelope ad, which, so there are different, recent authors who frequently take like a feminist perspective, and they want to reread the text from Penelope's point of view, or from Calypso's point of view, because Calypso is often sort of painted as a witch. But of course, when we look at the actual descriptions that the poet gives, like doesn't seem like a bad place to be. And so look at Calypso feels like she's being treated unjustly. Calypso shuddered at those words and burst into a flight of indignation. Hard-hearted you are, you gods, you unrivaled lords of jealousy, scandalized when goddesses sleep with mortals openly, even when one has made the man her husband. So again, this is this contradiction. She's not just saying it in terms of women and men, although we might see some of that in here, but she's definitely seeing it that also between nymphs and, I think, the kind of gods and goddesses. But even, she says, even when goddesses sleep with mortals openly. So whenever we immortals sleep with men, we get in trouble for this. We can't get what we want. Hard-hearted you are, you gods, you unrivaled lords of jealousy, scandalized when goddesses sleep with mortals openly, even when one has made the man her husband. So when Dawn, with her red rose fingers, took Orion, you gods, in your everlasting ease, were horrified till chaste Artemis, throned in gold, attacked him out on Delos, shot him to death with the gentle shafts. And so this is what I mean, is that the gods, we get Dawn taking Orion, the hunter, as a husband, and then the gods, whether they are female or male, Artemis, of course, being a woman, is just as bound to the sort of order of not letting that happen as anyone else. And so when Demeter, the graceful one with lovely braids, gave way to her passion and made love with Iasion, bedding down in a furrow plowed 3 times, Zeus got wind of it, and soon enough, I'd say, and blasted the man to death with flashing bolts. Now, of course, when Zeus goes down and, rapes a woman, it might cause some strife with Hera, his wife, but among the gods, but he generally gets away unscathed with those types of that type of behavior. So that double standard is definitely at work here. So what to sort of point out here, I think, is that just to notice that there's definitely enmity and jealousy between the gods themselves. There are definitely power hierarchies. There's definitely that gendered hierarchy at work. Even that, to the extent that immortal goddesses play the role of separating out, I don't know if we call them lesser goddesses, but definitely immortals, nymphs, for example, that make them unhappy. So now at last, you gods, you train your spite on me for keeping a mortal man beside me, the man I saved, riding astride his keel board all alone when Zeus, with one hurl of a white-hot bolt, had crushed his racing warship down the wine-dark sea. There all the rest of his loyal shipmates died, but the wind drove him on, the current bore him here. And I welcomed him warmly, cherished him, even vowed to make the man immortal, ageless, all his days. But since there's no way for another god to thwart the will of storming Zeus, and make it come to nothing, let the man go. If the Almighty insists, commands, and destroy himself on the barren salt sea, I'll send him off, but not with any escort. I have no ships in reach, no crews to ply the oars, and sending him scudding over the sea's broad back. But I will gladly advise him. I'll hide nothing so he can reach his native country unharmed. And the guide, the giant killer, reinforced her words. Release him at once, just so. Steer clear of the rage of Zeus, or down the years he'll fume and make your life a hell. Okay, so no messing with Zeus, even though he's full of double standards, and the other goddesses know it. There is an order to things, and people don't necessarily like it. So the theme of enmity between gods, sometimes breaking out or erupting into wars of gods, such as the clash of the Titans, for example, which we're not going to be covering too much in this text. We see that, at least in the Greek mythological culture, that the gods themselves do not get along with each other. With that, the powerful giant killer sped away. The queenly nymph sought out great Odysseus, the commands of Zeus still ringing in her ears, and found him there on the headland, sitting still weeping, his eyes never dry, his sweet life flowing away with the tears he wept for his foiled journey home, since the nymph no longer pleased. That's interesting. Since the nymph no longer pleased. Apparently he was happy for a while. In the nights, true, he'd sleep with her in the arcing cave. He had no choice. Unwilling lover alongside lover, all too willing. But all his days he'd sit on the rocks and the beaches, wrenching his heart with sobs and groans and anguish, gazing out over the barren sea through blinding tears. So coming up to him now, the lustrous goddess ventured. No need, my unlucky one, to grieve here any longer. No, don't waste your life away. Now I'm willing, heart and soul, to send you off at least. Come, take bronze tools, cut your lengthy timbers, make them into a broad-beamed raft, and top it off with a half-deck of high enough to sweep you free and clear on the misty seas. And I myself will stock her with food and water, ruddy wine to your taste, all to stave off hunger, give you clothing, send you a stiff following wind, so you can reach your native country all unharmed, if only the gods are willing. They rule the vaulting skies. They're stronger than I to plan and drive things home. For as bitter as Calypso is, this doesn't seem like just a raggedy raft that she's sending off Odysseus in. And so long enduring Odysseus shuddered at that and broke out in a sharp flight of protest. And I want you to see this kind of parallel that Odysseus has with his son Telemachus here, because we're going to see this as a theme throughout this chapter, is the theme of disbelief. Passage home? Never. Surely you're plotting something else, goddess, urging me in a raft to cross the ocean's mighty gulfs, so vast, so full of danger, not even deep-sea ships can make it through. Swift as they are and buoyed up by the winds of Zeus himself, I won't set foot on a raft until you show good faith, until you consent to swear, goddess, a binding oath, you'll never plot some new intrigue to harm me. So, traumatized, disbelief, suspicious is the way that we encounter Odysseus. And he's rebuked, although fairly gently, I think, by Calypso. What a wicked man you are, and never at a loss. What a thing to imagine, what a thing to say. Earth be my witness now, the vaulting sky above, and the dark cascading waters of the Styx. I swear by the greatest, grimmest oath that binds the happy gods, I will never plot some new intrigue to harm you. Never. All I have in my mind and devise for you are the very plans I'd fashion for myself if I were in your straits. My every impulse bends to what is right, not iron, trust me, the heart within my breast. I am all compassion. And so she leads him the way. and we start building. He's going to start building this ship. They reached the arcing cavern, man and god as one, and Odysseus took the seat that Hermes just left, while the nymph set out before him every kind of food and drink that mortal men will take. So again, there's this repeat, and even the line that says that now Odysseus is taking the seat where Hermes was in. There's that kind of transfer over, a kind of parallelism that I mentioned earlier on at the opening of the contextualized reading today. And then, of course, a repeat of the Xenia thing. So he's welcomed back in. It is gendered, of course. She is the servant. She's been kind of abused by the gods who neglected Odysseus to begin with, and then now are taking him away from her. And then she gets abused by Odysseus himself, who doesn't believe her when she says she's going to help him to get back home. Calypso sat down face to face with the king, and the women served her nectar and ambrosia. So then, just again, like the women, like where do they come from? Like they're just there, right? This is what I've said earlier on, and this goes into that critique of Western civilization stuff. It's subtle in the texts, right? But the expectation is that it's not just Calypso who's doing the serving here, right? She's not just this lone nymph, who's got her little house that's really homey inside a cave. There are servants there. So there are servants, there are slaves everywhere. It's just part of the unquestioned fabric of the way things are in this particular culture. They reached out for the good things that they lay at hand, and when they'd had their fill of food and drink, the lustrous one took up a new approach. So then, royal son of Laertes, Odysseus, man of exploits, still eager to leave at once and hurry back to your home, your beloved native land? Good luck to you, even so, farewell. But if you only knew down deep what pains are fated to fill your cup before you reach that shore, you'd stay right here, preside in our house with me, and be immortal, much as you long to see your wife, the one you pine for all your days. And yet I just might claim to be nothing less than she. Neither in face nor figure, hardly right is it for a mortal woman to rival immortal goddess. How in build, how in beauty. So jealousy definitely shows up here as well. And Odysseus does show some tact, at least here. He says, "Ah, great goddess, don't be angry with me, please. All that you say is true, how well I know. Look at my wise Penelope. She falls far short of you, your beauty, your stature. She is mortal after all, and you never age or die. Nevertheless, I pine all my days to travel home and see the dawn of my return. And if a god will wreck me yet again out on the wine-dark sea, I can bear that too, with a spirit tempered to endure. Much I have suffered, labored long and hard by now in the waves and wars, and add this to the total, bring the trial on." Okay, so he's willing to take more abuse, he says. And then we get nighttime coming. So even as he spoke, the sunset and the darkness swept the earth, and now withdrawing into the cavern's deep recesses, long in each other's arms, they lost themselves in love. So here they are. Obviously, love and sexuality doesn't necessarily work exactly the same way in the ancient world. But jealousy is definitely there. So after all of that's speaking. And then we get the next day. The day comes, and Odysseus gets on the move. He starts building the raft. He starts getting all of his affairs in order. And then at the end of that passage, lustrous Calypso came again, now with bolts of cloth to make the sail, and he finished that off too expertly, braces, shields, and brails. He rigged all fast on board, then eased her down with levers into the sunlit sea. It's almost like a montage scene that we sometimes see in action movies. And then we get an interesting passage where the constellations show up. And this is another one of those moments of parallelism, or that kind of accordion, moving in and kind of condensing the shift in aspect, or the shift in perspective. That shift in perspective definitely speeds up the storytelling. So we start with these longer glances, and then shift one place to another, and then we start moving down, shifting perspective back and forth quicker, and that gives us a kind of speed or an action element that feels in the storytelling. So that was the fourth day. So this is going on for multiple days, right? Just to be clear there. That was the fourth day, and all his work was done. On the fifth, the lovely goddess launched him from her island, and once she'd bathed and decked him out in fragrant clothes, and Calypso stowed 2 skins aboard, dark wine in one, and the larger one held water, added a sack of rations filled with her choicest meats to build his strength, and summoned the wind to bear him onward, fair and warm. The wind lifting his spirits, royal Odysseus spreading sail, gripping the tiller, seated astern, and now the master mariner steered his craft, sleep never closing his eyes, forever scanning the stars, the Pleiades and the ploughmen late to set, and the great bear that mankind also calls the wagon. She wheels on her axis, always fixed, watching the hunter, and she alone is denied a plunge in the ocean's baths. Hers were the stars of the lustrous goddess told him to keep hard to point as he cut across the sea. In 17 days he sailed, making headway well. On the 18th, shadowy mountains slowly loomed, the Phaeacians' island reaching toward him now, over the misty breakers, rising like a shield. And beautiful, like rising like a shield after we've just had the hunter, Orion the hunter, invoked, right? Who's got the archer, and so one thing I think is just like beautiful to notice is just how old. I think that it's important just to sort of step back and think about the ancient world and stars. And I don't have the time or the breadth of knowledge maybe right now to really do justice to just how important it is to the ancient world to think of the relationship to the night sky, which is something I feel like in my present culture, living in a city with light pollution and everything else, that there is like a really, really different human experience that we have in modernity than we have in the ancient world as well. But nevertheless, that we can still see, like if I can go, get far enough outside of the city, I can still find Orion the hunter, and that the constellations show up across maybe different cultures with different names or different formations, but our relationship as human beings to the night sky, I think, is really important. And now, just at the end, we've already known that it's going to take him 20 days to get there. And of course, Poseidon shows up. And where was Poseidon? He was back in Ethiopia, and he's returning, and he gets immediately pissed off at the other gods for taking advantage of him while he's been away, right? So again, that enmity showing up as a theme between gods here. Outrageous. Look at how the gods have changed their minds about Odysseus while I was off with my Ethiopians. Look at him there nearing Phaeacia's shores, where he's fated to escape his noose of pain that held him until now. Still my hopes ride high. I'll give that man his swamping fill of trouble. So a couple of things to notice. For those of you watching the course, you will know that I last weekend created a separate lecture about race and racism and Western civilization. And I was trying to draw out the differences between the kind of modern notions of racism, which are based on skin color, versus the ancient world, and how we see that in the ancient world, the skin color racism doesn't really work, and there aren't things like biological justifications, which developed in the 18th and 19th centuries in my culture, right? So in the 1700s and 1800s, there's this pseudoscience that we now know that it is, that tries to make out of race biological issues. So when we try and cast that kind of color-based racism back onto the ancient world, it's anachronistic. Because they don't seem to, and this is why I'm sort of pointing to it in this passage, even with Poseidon and going off to the Ethiopians, who are always figured as black, for example. The Ethiopians worship the same gods for the Greeks here, even though they're at the far edge of the world, right? Everybody is still sort of under the gaze of and in relationship in some way with the Greek pantheon here. And it doesn't seem to be that skin color is the thing. That now, this isn't to say that racism doesn't exist in the earlier ancient world, but it has a different form or different justifications of hierarchy. And so that's what I'm kind of trying to get at when I'm talking about the critique of Western civilization in these lectures and contextualized readings. It's more of the subtle stuff, like the fact that there are just servants there. We just expect that. We're not really surprised even now when we read. I have to sort of point out that it's subtle, that it's there, that there are people who are slaves who are doing the serving work. And I think that it's partly, like, because there's part of it that still exists in our culture today, right? Like, and people, you're hearing a story about people over dinner, and maybe they've gone out to a restaurant, there's still people serving them, and maybe hopefully they're not slaves, but there's definitely class differences, and certain groups that are in power over other groups for whatever sorts of reasons that we have that justify inequity in the world and power relationships with people. And that's where, if we were going to dig into something like a version of racism in the past, we would need to locate it not in the more recent sort of conceptions of skin color and the pseudoscience of biological definitions of race. We need to go and look. We need to look at things differently from a more historical perspective. I think that when people, such as critical race theorists, for example, they want to see that, or they make the claim rather that inequity persists across time and across culture, right? That it's always a part of human society. But what we get sort of, people I think get really conflicted about and up in arms about in recent discussions around race is the idea of how we're treating the past, for example. And what I think we all could do a little bit better is to step back and to see that, yes, racism is constructed. Race as we know it in the modern world is constructed, which is one of the tenets that the critical race theorists use, that race is socially constructed. But nevertheless, even though it's socially constructed, it has real effects on people in the world, even when we know that there's nothing like biological racism that holds any sort of scientific value. We still live in a culture that separates and that hierarchizes people's ontological experiences. So when we look back historically, if we were going to take, I think that we can step back from the color code racism and see it in terms of the inequities that persist throughout human cultures and human society, and it transforms and changes over time, right? That's kind of what if we're taking if you've read the Delgado book on critical race theory, for example, they sometimes separate out and people who are interested in critical race theory, those who are idealists and those who are kind of like materialists or realists. And in that camp or that divide, although I think that both camps are important, I tend to be more on the Derek Bell realist materialist side of things, if you're looking for where to place me. And this is not an in-depth lecture on critical race theory, so you can see my for more in-depth talk on race, just pop over to the race video after this, but I will point that stuff out along the way, because of course this is a class about this critique of Western civilization and why are we reading Homer at all. So back to the text here, though, because this is a contextualized reading, just to let you know, that is a place that I will point to as textual evidence. Poseidon's relationship with Ethiopians seems to suggest that it doesn't really matter that there's that the Ethiopians might have black skin and the Greeks have olive colored or skin. And of course, in my other lecture, I talk about people with white skin and the ideas about whiteness that I'm not going to talk about here today. So we see the enmity between Poseidon and the rest of the gods. And then back to Odysseus. So this is Poseidon, right? With that, Poseidon rammed the clouds together. Both hands clutching his trident, churned the waves into chaos, whipping all the gales from every quarter, shrouding over in thunderhead. And the earth and the sea at once, and night swept down from the sky. East and south winds clashed, and raging, west and north, sprung up from the heavens, roiled, heaving breakers up. And Odysseus's knees quaked, his spirit too, numb with fear, he spoke to his own great heart. And of course, this is like, it's a story, but who has time in the midst of like being shaken on a boat in the storm to make this kind of speech? But that shows, of course, another aspect that's important to Greek culture. Wretched man, what becomes of me now at last? I hear the nymph foretold it all too well. On the high seas, she said, before I can reach my native land, I'll fill my cup of pain. And now look, it all comes to pass. What monstrous clouds, King Zeus, crowning the whole wide heaven black, churning the seas in chaos, gales blasting, raging around my head from every corner, my death plunge in a flash, as it's certain now. There, 4 times blessed, my friends in arms who died on the plains of Troy those years ago, serving sons of Atreus to the end. Would to God I died there too, and met my fate that day. The Trojans, swarms of them, hurled at me with bronze spears, fighting over the corpse of proud Achilles. A hero's funeral then, my glory spread by comrades. Now, what a wretched death I am doomed to die. So here we get a sense of what Odysseus values, right? This is a really subtle and yet important aspect of the tale. And we're hearing it from his mouth himself, so that's important, I think. And what he wants is to be a hero. And the conception is that if you die an unknown death, not only do you die, right? But because no one has memory of you, something else dies as well. And this is what Telemachus is worried about as Odysseus' son. His father has died, nobody knows what happens to him, so he can't have any kind of inheritance. He can't sort of move on with his own life. He doesn't know who he is because he doesn't know how his own father died, right? And so this is very patriarchal, and it is very much violent, if you think about it. But it also, it isn't just that it's violent. It's that Odysseus will accept his own death, even a violent death, if it can just be a death that other people can see and remember, right? That's the important thing. He wants the hero's death. The servants and the slaves in the book, they're not the heroes, right? They're just kind of in the background texture like extras in a movie. And because I think this text has historically been taught within Western civilization, Western culture, to hold up Odysseus as a culture hero, there is this tendency within Western culture to have that same kind of, I think, lack of concern for the fact that violence is present in all things, and that even despite the fact that violence exists, what is most important is that the individual has done something great, something to be remembered for, right? That appears to be the cultural value. Authenticity. The word in Greek, if we trace it back, means kind of a self-thrusting. There are connotations, the one who kills with one's own hand. It's not just that I killed or that I'm violent. The violence is just there, but that I did it myself, and I own up to the fact that I did it myself, right? And there are particular connotations around patricide or killing fathers, and we've seen that in pantheons as well with so the relationship between parents and children, and how that is going to be transferred over is definitely a huge concern for the Greeks, as it is in this text itself, which, as I've been teaching it, really focuses on Telemachus, right? The first 4 books of the text are about Telemachus, but we remember it and we call it the Odyssey in our culture. So I want us to really be critical about the ways that we remember and place a text like this in our own cultural fabric and our own cultural traditions. Why is it that this book is so often assigned as mandatory in curriculum for high school students, for example, in my culture? I am not particularly opposed to anybody ever reading or preserving texts from the ancient world at all. I don't think that we can blame all of history, Western civilization, and the rhetorical appeals, whether they're white supremacist or not. I don't think that we can look back and blame that on this poet named Homer. I think that Homer gives us a glimpse of the inequities that exist in his society, and that some of those inequities do persist, or they get advertised and drawn out and extracted by certain people who want to keep their own power in a culture. And it is true that for hundreds of years, for centuries, English boys, for example, are raised on the Aeneid and raised on the Odyssey and raised on the Iliad. And so these values, the values of being a soldier, the values of being a hero, do get instilled intergenerationally, and they make their way into the fabric of what we might call Western civilization. And so we want to look at both the sort of long arc of things where we see some sort of continuity, but what I want us to be critical about is the uses of texts like this. Not a lot of people around the years 900 or 1000 in Europe, for example, are really, sitting around, they're having high schools and having students read something like the Odyssey. It's just was not happening historically. But something happens in the next 500 years, in that late medieval, early modern era, when universities are starting to be developed, when we start getting the first ideas of more recent public education, which is quite different than the Greek academies of the past. And so there's a lot of reimagining in the Euro-Christian, I will call them at that point, right? They're Christians by the year 1000, looking back and increasingly admiring the Greeks and being like, how can we set up something like the Greeks had and the Romans? Then when we start seeing that put into nationalized curriculum, I think that's all stuff to be very critical about, the use of a text like this. So back to the text, then Odysseus is here with glory. And then we get this very active scene, right, with the waves crashing. At that a massive wave came crashing down on his head, a terrific onslaught, spinning his craft round and round. He was thrown clear of the decks, the steering oar wrenched from his grasp, and in one lightning attack the brawling gale wind struck full force, snapping the mast mid-shaft and hurling the sail and sail yard far across the sea. We went under a good long while, he went under a good long while, no fast way out, no struggling up from under the giant waves' assault. His clothing dragged him down, divine Calypso's gifts. So again, like all of the stuff is sort of coming to pass, and he has to strip off the gifts that Calypso has given him. And then we see that someone sees him. He's going to die, and so there's this moment of like he is literally drowning. He's just in lost in depth. And then we see that another nymph, Ino here, or sorry, not necessarily nymph, but the daughter of Cadmus, one of the Phaeacians, Ino, sees him. And so we get this parallel of a womanly figure from the mortal world, although the Phaeacians are contextualized as being closer to the gods, sees him. And there's this kind of parallel between Ino and Athena here. And we've already seen that there was a parallel in some ways between Calypso and Athena. So there's the Athena, the very powerful immortal goddess who is at Mount Olympus. Then there's the nymph, who's a kind of lesser immortal. And then we see that there's Ino as well. So trials and tribulations aside, Odysseus is quite blessed, we might see, by his fate or by the overarching text itself. Cadmus' daughter with lovely ankles, Ino, a mortal woman, once with human voice and called Leucothea, now she lives in the sea's salt depths, esteemed by all the gods as she deserves. She pitied Odysseus, tossed, tormented, so she broke free. She broke from the waves like a sheer water on the wing. So look at how the text calls her a mortal woman once, so she's kind of a blend in between the mortal and the immortal. And so we're seeing this trajectory towards the mortal world. But he goes to the Phaeacians, and of course the Phaeacians are going to be, I think, both on the individual level and the group level, we're seeing this kind of shift back. I think that another thing to think about here is, I've been thinking about this in terms of myth classes and broader mythology. We can look at what's going on with Odysseus in this chapter as also a version of the flood story. It's a personalized version, definitely, of the flood, but there's something that goes on where he's being submerged in water at this moment of crisis in his life, and he's being pulled out and saved and reemerged. As well. So we might look at this as, although this is quite far before Christianity, for example, we might look at this in terms of a kind of baptism going on. Ah, poor man, why is the god of earthquakes so dead set against you, strewing your way with such a crop of troubles? But he can't destroy you, not for all his anger. Just do as I say. You seem no fool to me. Strip off those clothes and cleave your craft, for the winds to hurl, and swim for it now. You must strike out with the arms for landfall there, Phaeacian land, where the destined safety waits. Here, take this scarf, tie it round your waist. It is immortal. Nothing to fear now, neither pain nor death. But once you grasp the mainland with your hands, untie it quickly and throw it back into the wine-dark sea, far from the shore. But you turn your head away. So we get this interaction with an immortal object, the scarf, that is a gift. This takes us almost into fairy tale lore, so this is something that oftentimes sort of, if we're trying to think about genres of literature, an enchanted object of some sort sometimes takes us into fairy tale lore. as opposed to mythology. And so we see that showing up here. But also we get directions for what to do. You will take this scarf, it will do this thing, but here's how you give it back, and you don't look at when you're throwing it back. And so we've seen this before, right? We've seen a parallel all the time. We see that Odysseus gets saved. He often gets saved by a goddess or a woman in general. So remember that we had the daughter of the old man in the sea in an earlier book that saves Odysseus and goes against her father's wishes, right? In doing so, she just sort of naturally has this, takes a liking to Odysseus. He's charming in that respect. Odysseus's response, again, look at the parallel here. His response is immediately disbelief. That's one of the themes of this chapter. Oh no, I fear another immortal weaves a snare to trap me, urging me to abandon ship. I won't, not yet. That shore's too far away. I glimpsed it myself where she says refuge waits. No, here's what I'll do. It seems so it's best to me. As long as the timbers cling and the joints stand fast, I'll hold out aboard and take a whipping. Once the breakers smash my craft to pieces, then I'll swim. No better plan for now. But just as he does this, Poseidon comes and smashes his ship, of course. And Poseidon knows that Poseidon doesn't get to kill him, right? So around the lines 4:13, go, after all you've suffered, rove your miles of sea till you fall in the arms of the people loved by Zeus. Even so, I can hardly think you'll find your punishments too light. With that, he lashes his team, and then he backs off, right? And then Athena comes in and counters him. The rest of the winds she stopped right in their tracks, commanding them all to hush now, to go to sleep. And all but the boisterous north, she whipped him up, and the goddess beat the breakers flat for Odysseus, dear to Zeus, so he could reach the Phaeacians, mingle with men who love their oars, and escape his death at last. Yes, but now drifting on the heaving swells, 2 nights, 2 days, quite lost again and again, the man foresaw his death. Then when Dawn with her lovely locks brought on, again, that's another little shift for Dawn here. On the 3rd day, the wind fell in an instant. And so again, if we were going to go with some sort of structuralist take, that kind of take on baptism, there's a 3 days of a journey into like the underworld, and we'll see that later on as a theme that shows up in the underworld in this text, but we just see it as a mini motif that's going on in this particular chapter. Of course, the flood stuff, and we get in it, Jonah and the whale in the Old Testament, but it's just something a parallel to sort of point out here. Yet the broader context, and I was getting a little bit kind of mixed up with Phaeacians earlier, so just Ino, of course, was a mortal who became immortal, daughter of Cadmus. She sees him off of the island of the Phaeacians. The Phaeacians have been compared to gods, even though they are mortals. Odysseus has come from Calypso, a lesser goddess, and then before that, he's been overarchingly his lot in life has been championed by Athena, the goddess, right? So we're seeing a lot of gradation, is what I'm trying to get at, between the mortal and immortal worlds. And I think the reason why that's so important in this chapter, of course, is because Calypso makes this plea, or I guess not really a plea, but a disgruntled complaint about the fact that she gets screwed over when she takes a mortal man, to be her lover. But other gods get to do it. But when goddesses do it, they don't get to keep their mortal lover. There's some sort of outrage that it causes with the gods when the mixing of mortal and immortal happen. So Odysseus does seem to be caught in between the mortal and the immortal worlds. And then again, we get the flood imagery here. So dawn with her lovely locks brought the third day. The wind fell in an instant, all glazed to a dead calm, and Odysseus, scanning sharply, raised high by a groundswell, looked up and saw it landfall just ahead. Joy, warm as the joy that children feel when they see their father's life dawn again. One who's lain on a sick bed, racked with torment, wasting away slowly under some angry power's onslaught. Then what joy when the gods deliver him from his pains. Super loaded language there, right? Because we know that his son is looking for him. We know that Telemachus is looking for him. And so we get this great simile here that really speaks directly to Odysseus' situation, but also broadens it out to the experience of sickness, the experience of being near death, and the experience of being saved, or having some sort of God type of figure looking out for you and saving you. I will say that that is part of the Western civilization's sort of look at the world too. So we have the hero who wants to be remembered, despite violence, despite the idea of authenticity itself has a kind of violence to it. It shows up all the way in the 20th century philosophy of Martin Heidegger, for example, who says that to be authentic, to have authentic is to take arms up, to like look at our situation and see like we are maybe I'm screwed in some sort of way, maybe it's bleak, but I'm going to muster up all of my strength and go and do it, right? That I think is definitely part of what the Western civilization wants to see characteristically as something to be valued. It gets valued throughout literary texts for thousands of years, not just this one. But then again, on top of that is also the idea that the gods are going to save you. For the Greeks, the gods have enmity between themselves, and the gods are not always nice to us. But ultimately here, Odysseus has a kind of thankfulness. There's a joy that comes from knowing that I was going to die, but something else helped me and saved me. So warm Odysseus' joy when he saw that shore, those trees, as he swam on, anxious to plant his feet on solid ground again. But just offshore, as far as a man's shout can carry, he caught the boom of the heavy surf and jagged reefs, roaring breakers, crashing down on the iron-bound coast, exploded in fury. The whole sea shrouded, sheets of spray, no harbors to hold ships, no roadstead where they'd ride, nothing but jutting headlands, rip-toothed reefs, cliffs. So just when we think he's out of it, he's back in it, right? That's again what I mean by the accordion. It's like, oh shit. I thought I was okay, and now there's only reefs and jagged rocks that are going to smash me and kill me. And he says, there's no way out of this boiling surf. I see no way. So again, that theme of disbelief coming back in here. And then who comes in to save the day? A goddess, Athena, comes in. So just as the fear went churning through his mind, a tremendous roller swept him toward the rocky coast where he'd have been flayed alive, his bones crushed, if the bright-eyed goddess Athena, Pallas, had not inspired him now. He lunged for the reef. He seized it with both his hands and clung for dear life, groaning until the giant wave passed. And then we get this really great simile. It's one of my favorites in the chapter here. Like pebbles stuck in the suckers of some octopus dragged from its lair, so strips of skin, torn from his clawing hands, stuck to the rock face. A heavy sea covered him over, and then and there, unlucky Odysseus would have met his death against the will of fate, but the bright-eyed one inspired him yet on again. And then immediately when he gets, to this one point, so notice, this is again one of the very pagan elements of the text, despite the fact that Athena has been helping him on. He knows that gods are local, right? He sees this river, and he immediately prays to the river god. He says, "Hear me, Lord, whoever you are. I've come to you, the answer to all my prayers. Rescue me from the sea lord's curse. Even immortal gods will show a man respect, whatever wanderer seeks their help, like me. I throw myself on your mercy, on your current now. I have suffered greatly. Pity me, Lord." Your suppliant cries for help. So notice that how he's invoking Xenia here, right? Even immortals will show me hospitality if I ask for their help. So there is something about Odysseus that recognizes what is to be done in local situations, who to pray to. And then we do note that when he gets back, when he does get to shore, he does exactly what Ino says, right? At last he loosed the goddess's scarf from his body, dropped it into the river flowing to the sea, and a swift current bore it far downstream, and suddenly Ino caught it in her hands. Struggling up from the banks, he flung himself into the deep reeds. He kissed the golden green earth and addressed his fighting spirit, desperate still. And so again, we get this sort of self-speech from Odysseus. Everything is very externalized. We don't. There are little hints of internal thought going on, or internal inspiration coming from Athena, but really the way the storytelling works, and later literary critics will comment on this, that it's almost like the similar to stage actors, almost like the actors have to speak, or the character has to speak out loud to something, to orate in order to show us what's going on in their mind. Man of mystery, what's next? Is this the end? If I wait out the long tense night by the banks, I fear the sharp frost and the soaking dew together will do me in. I'm bone weary, about to breathe my last, and a cold wind blows from the river on toward morning. But what if I climb up that slope and go to the dark woods and bed down in the thick brush? What if I'm spared the chill, fatigue, and sweet sleep comes my way? I fear wild beasts will drag me off as a quarry. He finds 2 olive trees. This very interesting imagery that one is cultivated and one is not, that they're together going to shelter him. And then we get this final simile at the end. As a man will bury his glowing brand in the black ashes off on a lonely farmstead, so neighbors near to keep a spark alive. No neighbors near to keep a spark alive. No need to kindle the fire from somewhere else. So great Odysseus buried himself in the leaves, and Athena showered sleep upon his eyes. Sleep in the swift wave, delivering him from all the pains and labors. Blessed sleep that sealed his eyes at last. A beautiful simile there at the end. Now, I mentioned this theme profusely throughout chapter 5, or book 5 of the Odyssey, and it's the theme again of moving from the immortals to mortals, and that there's a lot of gradation in between them, but also that Odysseus seems to be favored by women, whether they're goddesses or mortal women. That we saw Ino as being in between, and I was kind of mentioning the Phaeacians, right? I was getting a little bit ahead of myself. If I'm thinking about the next book 6, which of course is called The Princess and the Stranger, which might give us a little bit of a clue to what he's going to be encountering on the island of the Phaeacians. But that is for another contextualized lecture. Thanks for your attention today. If you are getting anything out of this, please like us, subscribe to us on YouTube, and if you can, contribute to us on Patreon, because I'm hoping to be able to do this for more of a living, and that's not what's happening so far. But for the price of a cup of coffee or so a month, you can contribute to us, and the idea is that if a whole bunch of people find this mutually beneficial, then I'll be able to keep doing this with various different texts and helping other lecturers and thinkers come and be part of the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory as well. Thanks very much. Have a great evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are, whenever you are. Take care.